Galactic leaders watched in horror as humans walked away. The seat they gave me was made of steel. Every other delegate at the conclave of sovereign worlds sat in a chair carved from the stone of their home planet. The Varric Chancellor sat on a slab of black mineral that had been pulled from the core of his world 3,000 years ago. The Oran Matriarch rested on pale white coral from her ocean world. The Then Elder sat on something that looked like compressed bone and smelled faintly of copper. Mine was steel, brushed, cold, functional steel, the kind you find in a factory or a hospital corridor. I sat down in it without saying a word. My name is Yael Meren. I was 41 years old when Earth sent me to the conclave. I had spent 17 years working in interstellar diplomacy, first as a translator, then as an advisor, and finally as the head of Earth's External Relations Division. I had read every treaty the galactic community had ever produced. I had studied the Assembly's history going back 4,000 years. I knew exactly what I was walking into. That is the thing no one tells you about being a diplomat. Knowing the truth does not protect you from having to sit quietly while someone insults you with a smile. The chamber itself was extraordinary. It was built inside a hollowed asteroid that had been placed in permanent orbit around a neutral star. The ceiling was open to space through a shell of transparent material, so strong that it had never once cracked in 4 millennia. You could look straight up and see the stars, while the fate of worlds was being decided below them. I had read about this room in a dozen history books. Seeing it in person was something else entirely. There were 41 species represented. Some looked roughly humanoid, others did not look like anything I had a word for. The Miravi delegation was a cluster of floating geometric shapes that communicated through light pulses. The Drain sent a single representative, a creature roughly the size and shape of a large boulder, who had not moved or spoken since the session began. The air smelled of 100 different biological signatures, filtered and recycled by the station's systems into something breathable for everyone, which meant it was perfectly comfortable for no one. I had been the only human in the room for 3 hours before anyone addressed me directly. The Chancellor of the Varric Dominion was a tall creature with 4 arms and a face that expressed emotion through the color shifts in the plates along his jaw. His name, in sounds a human throat could approximate, was something close to Vorath. He had governed the Dominion for 60 years, which was considered young for his species. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had never once been told no. He explained Earth's situation clearly. Humanity had achieved interstellar travel 200 years ago. In that time, we had established 17 colony systems, signed trade agreements with 11 species, and had, as he noted with what passed for approval in his culture, engaged in no wars of territorial conquest. This last point seemed to genuinely surprise several of the other delegates. I had noticed them consulting records quietly when the figure was mentioned. Earth had applied for full membership in the Galactic Assembly 4 times over the past century. Each application had been reviewed, assessed, and deferred. The official language was always the same. Humanity showed great promise but required further evaluation. The criteria for evaluation were never made fully clear, which I had always suspected was the point. Today, Vorath explained, the Assembly had reached a decision. He used the word decision the way a teacher uses it when telling a child what they will be doing for the rest of the afternoon. Not a question, not a negotiation, a statement of fact delivered from a comfortable distance. Humanity would be granted provisional observed status. This was, he explained, a meaningful step forward. Earth's systems would be assigned a custodian fleet from the Varric Dominion for our protection and guidance. Trade access would be expanded under Assembly-monitored conditions. Human vessels operating beyond the outer boundary of our solar system would be required to file flight plans with Assembly navigation authorities. He said all of this while looking at a point approximately 2 feet above my head. I waited until he had finished. I had a glass of water on the small desk in front of me, the one concession to human biology that the station had provided. I took a slow drink. I set it down carefully. Then I asked the question that, I would later learn, had never once been asked in 4,000 years of Assembly proceedings. I said, in a voice that I kept very level, what would happen if we declined? The chamber did not go silent the way rooms go silent when someone says something embarrassing. It went silent the way a room goes silent when every single person in it suddenly realizes they are in a different situation than they thought they were in 30 seconds ago. Vorath's jaw plates shifted through 3 colors in rapid succession. The Oran matriarch leaned forward. Several of the smaller delegations began consulting quietly with each other, through whatever communication method they preferred. The boulder-shaped drain representative, who had not moved in 3 hours, turned very slightly in my direction. Vorath recovered quickly. He had not become Chancellor of the Dominion by losing composure in public. He smiled, which on his face involved the corners of his mouth pulling back to expose a row of flat, pale teeth. It was the kind of smile that is designed to communicate that the person smiling finds the situation more amusing than threatening. He said that declining was not, technically, an option on the table. I said I understood that was his position. I asked again what would happen if we declined. He said that the Assembly's offer was made in the spirit of interspecies cooperation and mutual benefit. I said I appreciated that, and I asked my question a third time. Someone in the chamber made a sound. I could not tell what species it came from, or what it meant, but it was brief, and then the silence came back, and this time it felt heavier. Vorath stopped smiling. He told me that the Assembly had mechanisms for handling non-compliance, that these mechanisms had been used rarely, and always with great care, that he was confident such measures would not be necessary in Earth's case, given our evident good sense. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my grandmother, who had spent 30 years organizing labor unions in a city where the people who owned everything had also, for a long time, owned the law. She had a saying that I had carried with me since I was a child. She said you only find out what someone actually thinks of you when you stop being useful to them, or when you stop being afraid of them. She said those 2 moments usually arrived at the same time. I thanked Vorath for his time. I closed the folder in front of me. I picked up the glass of water, finished it, and set it back down. Then I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of the chamber. Not quickly, not with any particular drama. I walked the way you walk, when you have somewhere to be, and you have already decided you are going there. I did not look back. Behind me, I heard Vorath say my name once, then the sound of the chamber beginning to talk, all 41 delegations at once, a noise like 41 different storms breaking at the same time. I kept walking. In the corridor outside, the station's lights were the pale gold of artificial afternoon. A young aide from the Assembly's hospitality staff was waiting to escort me back to the human delegation's quarters. He was a small, quick-moving creature with 4 eyes and the nervous energy of someone who had been watching a feed of the chamber proceedings and had just seen something he did not know how to categorize. He asked me if I needed anything. I told him I needed to send a transmission to Earth. He led me to the communication suite without another word. I sat down at the console. The screen showed the familiar blue interface of Earth's government network. I opened a direct channel to the Council of Nations in Geneva. The transmission would take 11 minutes to arrive. I typed 1 word. No. Then I sat back and waited for the world to change. The aide had still not said anything by the time I finished composing the rest of my message. He stood near the door with his 4 eyes arranged in an expression I had come to recognize as a kind of polite bewilderment. He had probably never seen a delegate leave the chamber without being either celebrated or escorted out by security. The concept of someone simply leaving because they wanted to seemed to be processing slowly. I did not explain myself to him. I had learned, over 17 years of diplomacy, that explanations offered before they are asked for almost always do more harm than good. They signal uncertainty. They suggest that you are still trying to convince someone, including yourself. I was not uncertain. The message I sent to Geneva was longer than 1 word, of course. The single word was the summary. The full transmission included a detailed account of everything that had been said in the chamber, a precise record of the terms Vorath had presented, and a formal recommendation from me, as Earth's senior delegate, that we exercise our right to non-participation in any arrangement we had not agreed to as an equal party. The council would deliberate. They always did. But I knew what they would decide. I had been chosen for this position, not because I was the most experienced diplomat Earth had produced, which I was not, but because I was the one who would do exactly what I had just done, and not flinch afterward. The council knew that. I knew they knew it. That had been the understanding from the beginning. What none of us had fully calculated was how fast the rest of the galaxy would notice. I found out the answer the next morning. By the time I woke up in the small, slightly too warm quarters the station had assigned to the human delegation, 47 news organizations operating across 12 different species had already run some version of the story. The headlines varied by species and cultural context, but the core of every one of them was the same. A human diplomat had walked out of the conclave. The first time in 4,000 years anyone had walked out of the conclave. My communications console had 89 messages on it. Most were from assembly staff requesting my immediate return to the chamber. 4 were from Varick diplomatic officers requesting urgent meetings. 1 was from the Orin matriarch's office, which did not request anything but simply said, in careful standard galactic script, that the matriarch had found my conduct interesting. I read that one twice. I replied to none of them. Instead, I opened the channel to Geneva and found that the council had already responded. The message was marked urgent, which in council language meant they had reached a decision faster than usual, which still meant a response time of about 9 hours. They had deliberated through their night. The reply was brief and clear. The council supported my recommendation. Effective immediately, Earth was initiating a full diplomatic withdrawal from all assembly-controlled spaces and proceedings. Every human vessel, citizen, representative, and officer currently operating in assembly territory was being contacted with instructions to file for departure clearance and return home. All 847 of them. I sat with that number for a moment. 847 ships, researchers, traders, cultural exchange workers, medical teams operating in cooperation with other species, navigators who had spent years learning assembly space lanes. Every one of them, turning around and coming home. Not because Earth had been threatened, not because a war had started, because we had been offered something we had not asked for, on terms we had not agreed to, and we had decided, quietly and completely, to decline. I got dressed. I went to the station's dining facility. I ordered breakfast from the human menu that the station maintained for our delegation. Scrambled eggs, toast, a pot of tea. I sat at a small table near the window that looked out on the docking arm, where Earth's delegation ship was moored. I could see the running lights blinking in the dark. I ate my breakfast. The Varick Chancellor's aide found me before I had finished. He was a young officer, sleek and precise, with the kind of posture that comes from years of military training. He stood at the edge of my table and waited for me to acknowledge him, which I did after I had finished my eggs. He told me that Chancellor Vorath was requesting an urgent private meeting. He used the word requesting, which told me something. Yesterday, Vorath had not been in the habit of requesting things from humans. I told the aide to inform the Chancellor that I appreciated the message, but that I was currently completing my departure preparations and would not have time for a meeting. The aide's jaw tightened slightly. He said the Chancellor believed the situation could be resolved to everyone's satisfaction with a brief conversation. I said I did not doubt the Chancellor's intentions, but that our position was not one that required a conversation to resolve. It was already resolved. The aide said, with visible effort, that the Chancellor was prepared to discuss modifications to the proposed terms. I looked at the aide for a moment. He was young. He was doing his job. None of this was his doing. I did not want to be rude to him. I said, as kindly as I could, that my grandmother had taught me something important when I was young. She had said that an offer made by someone who laughed at you first is not really an offer. It is just the laugh, dressed up in paperwork. The aide did not have an immediate response to that. I thanked him, finished my tea, and went to oversee the loading of the delegation's belongings. The departure from the station took 4 hours. There was no ceremony. The assembly staff watched us go with expressions I could not fully read. The Varick officers on duty at the docking arm stood at formal attention in a way that I suspected was meant to look either threatening or ceremonial, and managed to look like neither. Several small groups of other species observers had gathered at the observation points along the corridor, watching the human vessels file out of their berths and move toward the departure corridor. I stood at the observation window of our ship and watched the station grow smaller as we pulled away. It was enormous, even at distance. 4,000 years of galactic civilization, all gathered in one place, and we were leaving it behind. I felt, for a moment, the weight of that. I would be dishonest if I said I did not. But I also felt something else, something quieter and more certain. The same thing I had felt when I stood up from that steel chair. Not defiance exactly, not anger, something more like clarity. The kind you get when you stop pretending something is acceptable, because it has always been accepted. I had read, in my preparation for the conclave, a great deal about how the assembly viewed humanity. And we were, in their collective assessment, a young species, energetic, creative, in a somewhat unpredictable way, potentially valuable as a resource and partner, in need of guidance and structure, the way a river is in need of banks, to keep all that energy from spilling out in unhelpful directions. What they had not understood, what I do not think it had ever seriously occurred to them to consider, was that humans are not a river. We are not something that needs to be contained so that it can be directed. We are, if anything, the people who built the banks. We are the ones who looked at a flood and decided to make it useful. We did not do that by being managed. We did that by refusing to stop until we figured it out ourselves. The assembly had offered us protection. What they had not understood is that we are not afraid. Well, that is not entirely true. We are afraid of many things. Every human who has ever lived has been afraid. Fear is one of the few things we have always had in abundance. But we have also, for as long as we have existed as a species, had the habit of doing the thing we are afraid of anyway. Not because we are reckless, because we have learned, again and again, across thousands of years of difficult history, that waiting for someone else to make the world safe for you is the longest and most painful way to go about it. Vorath had offered us a cage and called it a home. We had said no. The ship broke out of the station's gravity field, and the stars spread out ahead of us, clean and endless, and belonging to no one. My communications officer, a steady, quiet man named Owen, told me we had received a formal protest transmission from the Assembly's Secretary Council. I told him to log it and file it in the record with all the others. He nodded and went back to his work. I stayed at the window a little longer. Out there, somewhere in the lanes of assembly space, 846 other human ships were turning for home. I thought about all the people on them. The researchers who had spent years building relationships with alien colleagues, the traders who had carved out good livings, the young people who had grown up wanting to see what was out there, all of them setting their course for Earth, because Earth had said no, and they trusted that. I hoped we were right. I was almost certain we were. I went to my quarters and slept better than I had in weeks. 3 Varric dreadnoughts appeared at the edge of our outer system 17 days after we got home. I was having lunch when Owen sent me the alert. Lentil soup, a good one. I had made it myself, which I did sometimes when I needed to think, because cooking requires just enough attention that you cannot spiral, and not so much that you cannot still be working through a problem in the back of your mind. I finished my soup before I walked to the communications room. The dreadnoughts were massive. Each one was roughly 5 kilometers long, built from a dark alloy that absorbed radar signals and reflected very little light. They were designed to be visible when their commanders chose to be visible, which was a statement in itself. They had stopped at the outer boundary of what the Assembly's own navigation charts designated as Earth's solar territory. They had not crossed it. They had also not identified themselves, filed an approach notification, or made any contact of any kind. They were simply there. The way a locked door is simply there. The way a large, quiet stranger standing at the end of your street is simply there. Our planetary defense network had, of course, detected them the moment they arrived. The alert had gone to the Council of Nations within seconds. The Council had convened within the hour. I was in Geneva by early afternoon, sitting in the same room where I had received their reply message 11 days ago, looking at a wall-sized display of our outer system, with 3 large red indicators sitting at the edge of it. The room was full of people with serious expressions: defense ministers, science advisors, representatives from the colony systems, attending by link. A man named George Archer, who ran Earth's Strategic Assessment Office and had the rare talent of being able to explain extremely alarming information in a completely calm voice, was standing at the front of the room with a pointer. He had already been through the technical details by the time I arrived. I caught up from the briefing notes on my tablet. The short version was this: the 3 vessels were Varric Sovereign class, the most powerful warships the Dominion operated. They were not carrying trade goods or diplomatic teams. They were carrying approximately 4,000 soldiers each, and enough energy weapons to reduce a small moon to debris. They had not done anything with any of this. They were just sitting there. The room was debating responses. Military readiness options. diplomatic outreach channels, emergency protocols for the colony systems. A general named Frances Aldred, who I respected enormously because she was the kind of person who thought slowly and acted deliberately, was walking through a set of defensive positioning options for our own vessels. I listened to all of it. I did not speak for almost an hour. Then I asked for silence, and because I had left the conclave 2 weeks ago and the story had been running everywhere since, I got it immediately. I said that I wanted to be very clear about what was happening. The Varric had not attacked us. They had not issued a demand. They had not even said hello. They had parked 3 large ships at our doorstep and were waiting to see what we would do. This was not a military action. It was a test, a very expensive, very visible test, designed to find out whether the humans who had walked out of the conclave were genuinely unafraid, or whether that had all been a performance that would collapse the moment something large enough appeared. The room was quiet. I said that the worst thing we could do was respond in a way that looked like fear dressed up as aggression. Scrambling our fleet would tell them exactly what they wanted to know. Sending urgent diplomatic messages would tell them the same thing from the other direction. Both responses said the same word. That word was panic. General Aldred looked at me. She had steady brown eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who has spent a great deal of time in situations where the wrong move had serious consequences. She asked what I proposed instead. I said I proposed we say something, once, clearly, and then we go about our lives and let them sit there until they get bored, or decide to have an actual conversation. There was a pause. Frances Aldred nodded, slowly, once. We drafted the message together, in that room, over about 40 minutes. It went through 7 versions. I wrote the first one, and she improved it significantly. The final version was short. In standard galactic script, which every Varric officer was required to read, it said the following: "We are aware of your presence. We do not recognize the authority of the Varric Dominion to station military vessels in or around our solar system without our consent. We are not alarmed. We are not going to ask you to leave, because that would imply we believe you have the right to decide whether to comply. We simply note that you are here without an invitation. We extend to you the same courtesy any visitor receives in human culture." We sourced the closing line from an old text, something my grandmother would have appreciated. Then we sent it and went back to our work. The Galactic Press had the message within 2 hours. It spread across 22 species communication networks within 12 hours of that. I was told later that the response in various alien media ranged from outrage among Varric commentators to careful silence from the Assembly's official channels, to what appeared to be something very close to laughter from the Then, who communicated amusement through a series of rapid color changes that their journalists included in the broadcast without further comment. The dreadnoughts did not move. Neither did we. On the 4th day, I received a private message from a Varric officer, not from Vorath, from someone lower in rank, a field commander named, in sounds my throat could manage, something close to Evish. He sent the message through a civilian relay channel, which told me he had sent it without official authorization. The message was brief. He said he had been a soldier for 30 years. He said he had served in 3 actual military engagements. He said that in all that time, across all the situations he had been in, he had never once been afraid of silence. He said he was finding it unexpectedly difficult. He did not ask for anything. He did not make any offer. He just said that, and then the message ended. I read it 4 times. Then I set it aside and went back to work. But I thought about it for a long time. While the Varric sat at our doorstep, the Assembly's intelligence community was doing something that we knew about, because Owen was very good at his job and had sources I will not detail here. They were pulling historical files on humanity, not the curated summary documents that had been included in our membership application, the actual records, going back as far as they could access. They found a complicated history, a difficult history, honestly, not one I would hold up as an unqualified source of pride in every detail. Humans had spent a very long time being very unkind to each other, and the record was there for anyone who wanted to read it. Wars that had reshaped continents, famines that should never have happened, systems of cruelty that had lasted centuries before being dismantled. But they also found something that, apparently, gave several Assembly intelligence analysts cause for long private conversations. We kept surviving. Not just surviving. Rebuilding. Every time something had broken us, individually, collectively, as nations or as a species, we had come back. Not the same, usually changed, usually chastened, often carrying new understanding bought at enormous cost, but back. Every single time. There was something in the pattern of human history that did not look like resilience in the way other species demonstrated resilience. It looked like something more stubborn than that. Something that did not have a good word in standard galactic script. In English, we sometimes called it spite. In its better forms, we called it hope. I learned later, from a source I trust, that one analyst in the Assembly's Strategic Division submitted a report during those days. The report's conclusion, translated as closely as I can manage, said something like this: humanity does not appear to be motivated primarily by fear of consequences. This is unusual. Most species that we observe develop cooperative behavior because they learn to fear what happens when cooperation breaks down. Humans appear to have developed something different. They cooperate when they choose to, abandon cooperation when they feel it is being imposed rather than chosen, and seem to regard the threat of negative consequences as, at most, a minor factor in their decision-making. We do not currently have a reliable model for predicting their behavior. The report, I was told, was marked for senior review and sat on 3 different desks before anyone knew what to do with it. The dreadnoughts sat at our border for 19 days. On the 20th day they left. No explanation, no communication, no parting message of any kind. They simply turned and went back the way they had come. I was in a council meeting when Owen sent me the alert. I paused, read it, set my tablet face down on the table, and finished the point I had been making about independent trade routing before mentioning it to the room. Frances Aldred, across the table, watched me do this. Afterward, when the meeting had ended, she stopped me in the corridor. She said she had a question. She said she hoped I did not mind. I said of course not. She asked what I had been thinking about while I finished my soup, on the day the ships arrived. I thought for a moment. Then I told her the truth. I said I had been thinking about my grandmother, and about what she used to say when someone tried to use fear to make her do something she did not want to do. Frances Aldred asked what she used to say. I said she used to say that a threat is only as heavy as the weight you choose to put on it, and that the choice, in the end, always belongs to you. Frances Aldred was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in years. We walked out of the building together, into a clear afternoon. Somewhere above us, the sky was empty. The ships were gone. The system was ours again, the same as it had always been, belonging to no one who had not earned the right through birth, or choice, or the long, slow work of making it home. We had not fired a single weapon. We had not issued a single threat. We had not asked for anything, and we had not begged for anything, and we had not given a single inch of ground that was ours to stand on. We had finished our soup. We had gone back to work, and the galaxy, slowly, was beginning to understand something about us that the history files had been trying to say all along. 14 months. That is how long it took. 14 months from the day I walked out of the conclave to the day I stood in the observation bay of the Aldrin station, the first fully human-built deep space habitat that did not rely on a single component sourced from assembly-controlled markets, and watched a cargo pod dock with a clunk that felt, to me, like a small but very satisfying kind of thunder. I had not expected to feel much. I had spent those 14 months working, almost without stopping, and people who work without stopping tend to process things slowly, in small pieces, the understanding arriving late and quiet, the way rain arrives after a long dry season. I had not cried when the dreadnoughts left. I had not celebrated when the first independent trade agreement with the Then came through. I had barely reacted when the Council of Nations expanded my mandate and gave me a team of 40 people and a budget that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. But I stood in that observation bay and felt the clunk of that docking pod, and something in my chest moved in a way I had not planned for. Owen was standing next to me. He had been with me since before the conclave, a calm and steady presence, who communicated primarily through carefully chosen words and the occasional raised eyebrow. He was looking out the same window. He said, quietly, that it was not bad for 14 months. I said no, it was not bad at all. What had happened in those 14 months was not the story that gets told in dramatic terms. It was the story of a very large number of people, doing very difficult things, without enough sleep, and with more arguments than anyone involved would like to admit. When Earth pulled out of assembly space, a lot of things broke. Some of those things were expected, some were not. The trade disruptions were expected. The supply shortfalls for certain specialized materials were expected. What was not expected, or at least not fully appreciated, was the degree to which the assembly's systems had been, quietly and gradually over 2 centuries, becoming dependent on human contributions that no one had properly catalogued. The medical synthesizer networks that operated across 7 assembly species ran on calibration algorithms developed by a research team in Osaka. The jump drive efficiency protocols used by 60% of the assembly's civilian shipping had been refined by an engineer named Carol Whitfield, who had been working on secondment with an Oran logistics firm, and had, apparently, improved their entire approach to fold space navigation in about 8 months, without anyone fully realizing she was doing it. The water reclamation patents that kept 4 assembly stations operational were held by a cooperative of engineers based in Wellington, who had developed the technology originally for Mars, and then sold the rights to the assembly at a price that, in retrospect, was far below what it was worth. None of these things had been part of any strategic plan. Humans had simply been out there, doing what humans do, solving problems, making things work better, leaving their fingerprints on everything they touched, and when they left, the fingerprints stayed, but the hands that knew how to maintain them were gone. The assembly did not collapse. I want to be clear about that. They were an advanced galactic civilization, with resources and knowledge spanning thousands of years. They adapted. They found workarounds. They brought in other specialists. They managed. But for about 4 months, they managed badly, and the gap was very visible, and the people living inside that gap noticed it in ways that did not make them feel warmly toward the assembly's leadership. Meanwhile, on Earth and in the human systems, something different was happening. The scientists who had spent years navigating assembly intellectual property frameworks, which were Byzantine and protective, and generally designed to keep the most valuable knowledge centralized in the hands of the oldest and most powerful species, were suddenly free of them. Research that had been stalled, delayed, or quietly suppressed because it threatened to compete with assembly-controlled markets began moving again. A team at the European Space Science Institute published a paper on a new approach to energy storage that had been sitting in review for 3 years. A biomedical research group in Nairobi developed a treatment protocol for a degenerative condition affecting humans in low-gravity environments that the Assembly's medical authorities had shown no interest in addressing. A manufacturing collective in Sao Paulo produced the first fully human-designed Starship drive system that did not require any component licensed from an assembly supplier. They called it the Marin drive, which I found both embarrassing and quietly wonderful. I went to see the drive when it was first installed in a test vessel. I stood in the engineering bay and looked at it for a long time. It was not beautiful in the way that some machines are beautiful. It was practical, a little rough around the edges, clearly the product of people who had been working very hard and very fast and had prioritized function over elegance. But it worked. It worked on the first test. It worked on the second test. It worked every time after that. The engineer who had led the design team was a woman named Ruth Calloway. She was 53, with grease on her hands, and the particular exhausted satisfaction of someone who had just finished something that had cost them more than they expected. She showed me the drive with the pride of a parent and the pragmatism of a professional. She said it was not perfect yet. I said it was perfect enough. She laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that comes from a place of genuine relief. The day after I visited Ruth's team, I received an unexpected message. It came through a back-channel relay that our communications office flagged as originating from Then diplomatic space. The Then were one of the species I had noticed at the conclave, one of the smaller and older civilizations that had been granted full membership in the assembly several centuries ago, but had always, from what I could observe, sat at that table with a particular kind of careful silence. The message was from someone named, in the sounds I could manage, something close to Thavrin. It identified him as a senior cultural liaison from the Then collective. It said, in careful standard galactic script, that the Then had been watching the events of the past year with considerable interest. It said that the Then had, themselves, applied for certain expansions of their assembly rights on 6 different occasions over the past century, and had been deferred each time. It said that Thavrin had been authorized by his leadership to inquire whether humanity might be open to a direct, assembly-independent conversation about shared interests. I read the message 3 times. Then I showed it to Owen, who read it once, and said that this was the part he had been waiting for. Within 3 months, we had received similar messages from 2 other species. The Oharak Collective, a loose federation of 7 worlds that had been in the assembly for 400 years, but had never been granted access to the inner chambers, where actual policy was made, and the Miravi, the geometric floating entities I had noticed at the conclave, who it turned out communicated with extraordinary precision and had a great deal to say once they had decided they trusted the people they were talking to. All 3 were different from each other in ways that made cooperation complicated, but all 3 shared something important with us. They had all been, for a long time, managed rather than heard. That turned out to be a strong foundation. We met for the first time on a neutral station, a small, older facility that had originally been built for asteroid mining and had been repurposed over the years into a kind of informal waypoint for species that needed a place to talk that was not an assembly facility. It smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and something the Miravi emitted that I never successfully identified, but which my brain persistently interpreted as the smell of rain on stone. The conversations were not easy. Diplomacy rarely is. But there was something different about these conversations compared to the ones I had spent 17 years having within the assembly's structure. In the assembly's chambers, everyone was always aware, at every moment, of what they were not saying. The silences were full of calculations about position and power and precedent. Here, the silences were just pauses, people thinking, or not people. Thavrin and I had a lengthy discussion at one point about whether the word people was the right one to use for a gathering like ours, and we concluded that it was close enough, and that we could revisit it later if necessary. The Oharak representative, a person named Lena, told me, on the second day, that her species had been trying to write a formal objection to a specific assembly navigation policy for 80 years, and had been unable to find a mechanism by which it would be accepted for review. I asked what the policy was about. She explained it. The short version was that the policy effectively required Oharak vessels to file a secondary approval request with a Varric navigation authority anytime they traveled through a particular corridor of space, which added weeks to any journey through that region, and was, she said with careful understatement, inconvenient. I asked how many times they had made the journey anyway. She said thousands. I said that sounded like people who had figured out how to live with an unreasonable rule because they did not yet have a better option. She looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of someone hearing their own life described accurately by someone who was not supposed to understand it. I said that I thought we might be able to help each other find that better option. The assembly, meanwhile, was not unaware of what we were doing. The formal invitation for humanity to return to negotiations arrived in my inbox on a gray Tuesday, marked urgent, in an envelope that the Assembly's Secretary Council had clearly spent time designing to look both official and conciliatory. The terms it described were different from what Vorath had offered at the conclave, more nuanced, more respectful, on the surface. The custodian fleet was not mentioned. The language about guidance and protection was replaced with language about partnership. I read it carefully. I read it again. Then I set it on my desk and went to my next meeting. Not because I was dismissing it, not because I had decided the answer was no, but because I had learned, in those 14 months, something important about timing. The Assembly had sent that invitation because they needed to send it. They were in a position of wanting something from us, for the first time in 4,000 years of their history. That was a new situation for them, and new situations, in diplomacy as in most of life, benefit from being allowed to settle before anyone reacts to them. I was, for the first time, not in a hurry. Ruth's drive was in 3 ships now. The independent station was running. The conversations with the Then and the Oharak and the Miravi were progressing. Earth was, in measurable terms, in a stronger position than it had been 2 years ago. Not because we had fought anyone, not because we had been given anything, because we had stopped waiting for permission and started building. My grandmother had told me something else, besides the things I have already mentioned. She had told me that the most dangerous negotiating position you can be in is the one where you need the deal more than the other person does. She had spent decades making sure that her people always had other options before they sat down at a table. Not because she wanted to be difficult, because she wanted to be honest. A person with no alternatives tells the truth about their situation whether they want to or not. A person with alternatives can be honest by choice. She always said she would rather have the choice. We had alternatives now. I stood in the observation bay of the Aldrin station for a long time that day, watching ships move in the dark. Human ships, Then ships, an O'Haric vessel that had come to tour the facility as part of what was quietly becoming something more than a friendly visit. Owen stood next to me, and we did not say much, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about working with him. After a while, he said that the assembly had sent a follow-up to the invitation, a softer message this time. Almost, he said, reading carefully from his tablet, apologetic. I said that was interesting. He said he thought so too. I said we would respond in the morning. He said that sounded right. We stayed at the window a little longer, and the stars did what they always do, which is shine without asking anyone's permission, which has always seemed to me like the most honest possible thing to do. The second time I walked into the conclave chamber, I brought 11 people with me. That is not quite accurate. The correct number was 11 representatives, each speaking for a species, which meant, depending on how you counted it, that I was walking in on behalf of somewhere between 3 and several hundred billion people. But 11 was the number of seats at the table we had built, and 11 was the number of people who stood up and walked into that chamber beside me, and 11 was, on that day, the number that mattered. The chamber looked the same. The stars through the ceiling, the stone chairs, the pale gold of the artificial lights, 41 delegations from the original assembly, all present, all watching. Some of them had new faces since the last time I had been here. Vorath was not in the room. He had retired 6 months prior, which I had heard about through the standard news channels, and had thought about briefly, and then moved on from, because it was not, in the end, the individuals who mattered. It was the structure. It was always the structure. The new Varric Chancellor was a person named Orith, younger than Vorath, with a different manner. She had reached out to me twice in the months leading up to this moment, through official channels, in a way that was formal but not unfriendly. We had exchanged 3 messages. None of them had been about custody or protection or terms. They had been about logistics, where we would sit, how the formal proceedings would open, the small administrative realities of bringing 12 delegations into a room that had been built for one kind of conversation and was now being used for a different kind. The table we had built was not a metaphor. It was an actual table. It had been constructed on the Aldrin station and transported here. It was made of aluminum alloy, produced in a facility in Iceland, which I mention, not because it matters what it was made of, but because I wanted the record to show that humans had built it, and that it was therefore functional and slightly over-engineered, and would probably last for 1,000 years without requiring much maintenance. Around it, 12 seats. The Then configuration, which I will not describe in physical detail because it is complicated, had been worked out by Ruth's team in consultation with Thavrin's cultural office. The Miravi did not use a seat in any conventional sense, but had a space designed for them that they had approved after 3 rounds of consultation. The O'Haric chairs were simple and straight-backed, which Lena had specified. My seat was made of steel. I had asked for that. The room noticed. The assembly delegations noticed. Several of the feeds that were broadcasting the proceedings live noticed, and the mention of it circulated for a long time afterward, although I did not see most of that coverage until much later. We sat down. The proceedings opened with a formal address by the Assembly's Secretary Council, a collective body that managed the administrative functions of the chamber. The address was longer than it needed to be, as formal addresses usually are, and covered the historical context of the session, the procedural rules that would govern the day, and a careful, diplomatically worded acknowledgement that the situation represented a new chapter in the Assembly's history. I listened. I did not take notes. I have always found that taking notes during someone's formal opening address communicates a kind of deferential attention that I do not always feel, and on that day, I definitely did not feel. When the address concluded, I was given the floor. I had prepared remarks. I want to be honest about that, because people have sometimes told the story of what I said that day as if I improvised it. as if it came from some spontaneous place of feeling. It did not. I had written it carefully, revised it many times, read it aloud to Owen, and to Lena, and to Thavrin, and to Francis Aldred, who had made the trip for the occasion, and to a few others, whose judgment I trusted. Every word had been considered. But I will also say that when I stood up and looked around that room, the prepared words felt true in a way that preparation alone does not always produce. They felt like something I had been carrying for a long time, that I was now, finally, setting down in exactly the right place. I said that the Sovereign Compact was not a challenge to the Galactic Assembly. I said that it was not a rejection of the idea that species should work together across the distances of space, because that idea was one of the most important ideas any civilization had ever developed, and we believed in it completely. I said that what we were was a different answer to the same question. How do you build a structure that allows different kinds of people, from different worlds, with different ways of living and thinking and communicating, to work together honestly? The Assembly had answered that question 4,000 years ago, and had done remarkable things with that answer. But an answer that works for 4,000 years can still fail to work for the people who were not part of writing it. I said that every species represented in the Sovereign Compact had, at some point, applied to the Assembly for a fuller voice in the structures that governed the space around them. Every one of us had been told to wait, to be patient, to be grateful for what we had already been given, and for a long time, most of us had done exactly that. I said that what had changed was not that we had become unwilling to cooperate. What had changed was that we had stopped believing that cooperation required silence. The chamber was very quiet. I looked at Orith, the new chancellor. She was watching me with an expression I found difficult to read. Not hostile, not warm exactly. Attentive, in the way of someone who was genuinely trying to understand something new, and had decided, at least for this moment, to keep their conclusions open. I said that the Sovereign Compact's founding charter was based on one principle. No species holds custodianship over another. Every member had full sovereignty over their own systems, their own decisions, their own future. We would cooperate by choice, not by obligation. We would share what we developed freely, not under license that kept the power concentrated in the hands of whoever happened to arrive first. We would resolve disagreements through conversation, and if we could not resolve them through conversation, we would learn to live with the disagreement, rather than force a resolution that one party had not genuinely accepted. The then ambassador, who was sitting to my left, had described our charter to me the previous week as offensively simple. He had said it with affection. He said that in 400 years of assembly proceedings, he had never once seen a foundational document that anyone could read without a legal interpreter. He said ours took about 8 minutes and left very little room for creative misunderstanding. I had told him that was the point. After I finished speaking, there was a pause that lasted long enough that I had time to take a slow drink of water, set the glass down, and look at the stars through the ceiling for a moment. Then the Assembly's deliberations began. They lasted 3 days. I will not recount all of them. Diplomatic proceedings at this level are, in many ways, less interesting than they sound from the outside, because most of what happens is incremental, careful, repetitive, and dependent on understanding a great deal of context that takes years to accumulate. What I will say is that the debate was genuine. There were Assembly members who were outraged, who saw the compact as a threat, who argued that recognizing it would weaken the Assembly's authority in ways that could not be recovered from. There were also Assembly members who were relieved, who said things in the chamber that I suspect they had wanted to say for a very long time and had not had the appropriate moment to say until now. Orith spoke on the second day. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not pretend that the Assembly had handled humanity's membership applications well. She did not pretend that the offer made at the original conclave had been made in a spirit of true equality. She said that the history of how large structures treat smaller and newer members was, if you were honest about it, not always a history that large structures found comfortable to examine. She said that the Assembly had benefited from human contributions for 2 centuries without fully accounting for what that meant, in terms of what was owed in return. She said that she believed the right response to the existence of the Sovereign Compact was not to reject it, but to let it teach the Assembly something. There were voices in the chamber that disagreed with her, some of them loudly. But when the formal vote was called on the 3rd day, on the question of whether the Galactic Assembly would recognize the Sovereign Compact as a legitimate interstellar body, with full rights to operate independently in sovereign and neutral space. It passed. Narrowly, by a margin that was close enough that I did not exhale until the final count was confirmed. But it passed. Owen, who was sitting in the observation gallery above the main floor, sent me a message on my personal device the moment the count was announced. It said, "Your grandmother would have liked this." I read it twice. I did not reply, because I did not trust my voice, and because some things do not need a reply. Afterward, when the formal session had concluded, and the chamber was beginning to clear, Orith crossed the floor and stopped a few feet from our table. She was taller than me by about half a meter. Her jaw plates were calm, a steady neutral color that I had learned, over the preceding months, indicated something close to thoughtfulness rather than emotion. She said she wanted to understand something, if I was willing to discuss it. I said of course. She said she had read the full account of the original conclave session. She had read Vorath's report. She had studied the recordings. She said that the question she kept returning to was not what I had said or what I had done. It was the timing. She asked why I had finished my soup. I looked at her for a moment. It was such a specific question. It told me she had read the accounts very carefully. It told me she had been thinking about this for some time. I said it was because I was hungry, and because the soup was good, and because the ships were not going anywhere, and because I had learned from someone I loved that the first thing you lose when you are afraid is your appetite, and I had decided a long time ago that I was not going to be the kind of person who lets fear take her lunch. Orith was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought she understood. She said she hoped, going forward, that we might have more conversations. That there was a great deal the Assembly could learn, she thought, from people who had decided not to be afraid. I said I thought there was quite a lot we could learn from each other, if we were both willing to actually listen. She said that seemed like a reasonable place to start. We shook hands. Well? She extended one of her 4 hands and I shook it, which was not in Varric custom, and which I had not expected, and which told me that she had done some research of her own. It was a small thing, but small things, in my experience, are where the real decisions live. 3 weeks later, I was back on the Aldrin station. There was a Meravi vessel docked on the far arm, offloading medical supplies for a joint research project that had been running for about 6 months. Lena was there with a team from the Oharak Collective, going over revised navigation protocols for the corridor that Oharak vessels had been forced to request secondary approvals to travel through for 80 years. The new protocols did not require secondary approval. They required a standard notification filed once, automatically, through a shared system that the Oharak and human technical teams had built together in about 3 months. It was not complicated. It had just needed someone to decide it was worth building. Ruth Calloway was there too, in the engineering bay, making improvements to the drive that she had not been satisfied with since the original installation. She had a new version running in simulations that she said was 30% more efficient, which she described as acceptable, and which I chose to interpret as modest. I went to find Owen, who was in the communications room, doing what he always did, which was monitoring 17 different channels simultaneously, and looking completely calm while doing it. I told him I had a message to respond to. He asked which one. I said the Assembly's follow-up. The one he had told me about that night on the station. The one he had described as almost apologetic. He pulled it up on the screen. I read it again. It was, as he had said, different in tone from anything that had come before it. It asked about areas of potential cooperation. It asked about shared infrastructure. It asked whether the Sovereign Compact would be open to joint research projects in fields of mutual benefit. It used the word mutual 3 times, which I thought was interesting. I sat down and began to write a reply. I did not write no. I did not write yes, unconditionally. I wrote a careful, honest response that outlined what cooperation between the Assembly and the Compact might look like, what principles would need to govern it, and what the Compact would require in terms of equal standing in any shared endeavor. It was a long letter. Owen read it over my shoulder and said it was good. I sent it. Then I went to the observation bay, because that had become something of a habit, and I stood at the window and watched the ships moving in the dark. A human cargo vessel, registry out of the Auckland system, was pulling away from the dock and setting course for a Miravi colony, 3 systems over. It was carrying nutritional compounds that the Miravi had been unable to produce locally, since a blight had damaged their cultivation networks 8 months ago. No assembly authorization had been required. No treaty had been filed. A Miravi cultural liaison had contacted a human trade organization. 2 people had had a conversation, and a ship had been loaded. That was all. That, as it turned out, was the part that had always mattered. Not the votes. Not the chambers. Not the formal recognition or the historic proceedings, or the seats made of stone. All of those things were real, and they mattered in their way. But the thing that made them mean something was always this. 2 sets of people, from 2 different worlds, deciding that the distance between them was worth crossing. My grandmother had spent her life building the conditions under which that kind of decision could be made freely, by people who were not afraid, and were not desperate, and were not asking for permission. She had done it in one city, on one planet, through 30 years of careful and stubborn, and occasionally exhausting work. I had tried to do something similar, at a slightly different scale. I looked at the stars and thought about her. I thought about the steel chair, and the cup of tea, and the single word I had transmitted to Geneva, and all the months and arguments and careful letters and quiet moments that had followed from it. I thought about Ruth's drive, and Lena's navigation protocols, and the Miravi cargo, and the vote that had passed by a margin thin enough that I still felt it in my chest when I thought about it. I thought about what we had built, and I thought about what there was still left to build, which was most of it, which was the only part that had ever been interesting to me. The cargo ship's lights blinked twice as it cleared the station's gravity field. A small thing, a human habit, something pilots did when they passed a station they knew, a kind of wave. I watched it go. Then I turned around and went back to work.